People like you should know your place, Ethan Cole said, loud enough for the entire street to hear, his voice cutting through the late evening air like a blade as traffic lights flickered from green to red above the intersection, and the low hum of engines idling filled the silence that followed. A few pedestrians slowing their steps, not stopping completely, but just enough to witness something they didn't want to be involved in. Their reflections stretching across the glass windows of a closed pharmacy behind them while Marcus Reed stood still on the sidewalk, one hand loosely holding a folded document, the other resting calmly at his side, his posture straight but not confrontational, his expression unreadable in the glow of a street lamp that buzzed faintly overhead, casting a pale circle of light that seemed to isolate him from the rest of the world, as if everything beyond that small space had decided to look away. And Ethan, dressed in a tailored jacket that still held the crisp lines of privilege, took a step closer, his confidence fueled not by anger but by certainty, the kind that came from never having been questioned, never having been told no, the kind that lived quietly behind a last name everyone in the city recognized, Cole, a name that opened doors, silenced doubts, and bent rules without ever needing to try. And behind him, a couple of his friends lingered near a black SUV parked at the curb, their laughter low, uncertain, unsure whether this moment was entertainment or something they should pretend not to see. But no one intervened, no one spoke, because power has a way of shaping silence. And Marcus, still unmoving, lifted his eyes just enough to meet Ethan's gaze, not with defiance, not with fear, but with something quieter, something heavier, something that didn't belong in a confrontation like this. And for a fraction of a second, it unsettled Ethan in a way he couldn't explain, like looking into a mirror that didn't reflect what he expected. But the feeling passed quickly, buried under the weight of expectation, of who he was supposed to be in this moment. And he let out a short laugh, shaking his head as if dismissing something trivial. Something beneath him, while a car horn echoed from down the block and the wind carried the faint scent of rain that hadn't yet begun to fall, and Marcus finally shifted, not stepping back, not stepping forward, just adjusting the sleeve of his coat with a slow, deliberate motion that drew attention to his composure more than any words could. And when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, almost too calm for the tension hanging in the air. "You should think carefully about what you're doing," he said, each word landing softly but with a weight that didn't match his appearance, didn't match the assumptions already made about him. And Ethan smirked, tilting his head slightly, as if amused by the audacity of being addressed that way, as if the suggestion itself was a joke, something to be laughed off and dismissed. And somewhere above them, a security camera rotated slowly on its mount, capturing everything without judgment, without context, just recording a moment that neither of them fully understood yet. And as the light shifted again, casting longer shadows across the pavement, the space between them felt smaller, tighter, like something unseen was closing in, something inevitable, something that would not stay hidden for long. The city did not change after the words were spoken, but something beneath the surface shifted, subtle and quiet, like the pressure before a storm that had not yet broken. And Marcus Reed felt it in the way the air settled heavier around him, in the way the murmurs of the passing crowd softened into something more cautious, more observant, as if the scene unfolding on that corner had begun to take on a shape people could not yet name, but instinctively understood was not ordinary. And he lowered his gaze briefly, not in submission but in thought, his fingers brushing lightly against the folded document he still held, the edges worn from use, the paper itself unremarkable to anyone who might glance at it, yet carrying a weight far beyond its appearance. And for a moment, his mind drifted not to the present confrontation, but to the long hours spent in quiet courtrooms, to the echo of measured voices, to the discipline of listening before speaking, a habit that had defined him long before this night, long before this street. And when he looked back up, his expression had not hardened, had not sharpened. It remained steady, composed, almost patient, as if he were waiting for something that had not yet revealed itself. And across from him, Ethan shifted his stance, a slight flicker of irritation crossing his face, not because of anything Marcus had done, but because of what he had not done, the absence of reaction, the refusal to play the role expected of him. And it unsettled him in a way he could not easily dismiss, because power, the the kind he had always known, relied on response, on fear, on visible acknowledgement. And here there was none, only stillness, only a quiet presence that did not bend. And one of Ethan's friends cleared his throat softly, glancing down the street where a pair of headlights approached slowly, then looked back at Ethan with a hesitant expression, as if silently asking whether this moment had gone far enough. But Ethan did not step back, did not disengage. Instead, he exhaled sharply, forcing a laugh that sounded thinner this time, less certain. "You think you can tell me what to do?" he said, his voice rising just enough to reclaim the attention he felt slipping, and Marcus tilted his head slightly, not in challenge but in acknowledgement, as though he were considering the question seriously, weighing it. And when he spoke again, his tone did not change. It remained even, controlled, carrying a quiet authority that did not announce itself. "I am not telling you what to do," he said. "I am asking you to think about what comes after." And the words lingered in the space between them, not loud, not dramatic, but precise, and something in the phrasing seemed to land differently, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a statement rooted in certainty. And for a brief second, Ethan's smile faltered, the edges tightening as if he had heard something he did not fully understand, but could not entirely ignore. And the headlights drew closer now, washing the scene in a brighter glow, illuminating the details that had been softened by shadow, the texture of the pavement, the faint scuff marks on Marcus's shoes, the slight crease in Ethan's jacket. And in that light, the contrast between them became clearer, not just in appearance but in presence, one grounded, composed, anchored in something deeper than the moment, the other restless, pressing forward, driven by something that demanded immediate recognition, immediate control. And the car slowed as it passed, the driver's eyes flicking briefly toward the scene before continuing on, carrying the moment with them as a story that would be retold differently each time. And Marcus took a slow breath, steady and measured, the kind that came from years of discipline, from understanding that not every moment required force, that sometimes the most powerful action was restraint. And he adjusted his coat once more, a small, deliberate gesture that signaled not retreat, but readiness, as if he were preparing for what he already knew was coming, even if no one else on that street could see it yet. The distant wail of a siren began as a faint thread in the background, barely noticeable at first, then gradually growing louder as it echoed between the buildings, bouncing off glass and steel until it became impossible to ignore. And the sound shifted the atmosphere on the street in an instant, tightening conversations, slowing footsteps, drawing attention in a way that nothing else had. And Ethan turned his head slightly toward the noise, a smirk forming again as recognition settled in, not of concern but of familiarity, the kind that came from knowing exactly how situations like this usually ended. And one of his friends straightened up near the SUV, adjusting his jacket as if preparing for something routine, something expected, while Marcus remained where he stood, his posture unchanged, his eyes following the flashing red and blue lights as they approached, reflecting off the storefront windows and painting the pavement in alternating color, a rhythm of authority that most people instinctively responded to. But Marcus did not move, did not step back, did not signal distress. He simply watched, his expression thoughtful, almost distant, as if measuring something beyond the immediate moment. And when the patrol car pulled to a stop along the curb, the engine idling with a low vibration, two officers stepped out, their presence immediately altering the balance of the scene. One older, his movements deliberate and controlled, the other younger, scanning quickly, taking in details with the sharpness of someone still proving themselves. And their eyes landed first on Ethan, recognition flashing instantly, followed by a subtle shift in posture that carried the weight of familiarity, respect, and something quieter beneath it, something closer to alignment. And Ethan did not hesitate. He stepped forward half a pace, his confidence returning fully now, anchored by the arrival. "Officers," he said, his tone casual, almost welcoming, as though greeting acquaintances rather than responding to a call. And the older officer nodded slightly, his gaze flicking briefly toward Marcus before returning to Ethan. "Everything all right here?" he asked, the question sounding more like confirmation than inquiry. And Marcus felt the shift as clearly as the siren had cut through the air, not in the words themselves, but in the direction they leaned, the invisible line that had already been drawn before anyone spoke further. And he took a slow breath, steady and measured, the kind that grounded him in moments where perception moved faster than truth. And he did not interrupt, did not raise his voice. He allowed the moment to unfold, watching carefully, listening, as Ethan gestured lightly in his direction, his expression carrying a practiced mix of irritation and control. "Just a misunderstanding," he said. He started causing a scene. And the words hung there, simple, efficient, designed to settle the narrative before it had a chance to form differently. And the younger officer shifted his stance, glancing again at Marcus, taking in the details, the calm posture, the absence of agitation. And something in that observation slowed him, just slightly, as if the picture did not align as easily as expected. But the older officer stepped forward, his tone firm but not aggressive. "Sir, we are going to need you to come with us so we can sort this out," he said, directing the statement toward Marcus, and the phrasing was polite, controlled, yet carried an assumption that had already chosen its direction. And Marcus nodded once, not in agreement with the implication but in acknowledgement of the process, his eyes steady as he met the officer's gaze. And for a brief second, there was a flicker there, something unspoken passing between them, something that did not fully register but lingered just long enough to leave an impression. And as the red and blue lights continued to pulse against the night, reflecting in the glass and across the faces of everyone watching, the scene settled into a shape that felt familiar to some, inevitable to others, and quietly, almost imperceptibly, began to move toward a moment none of them were prepared to understand. The moment settled with a quiet finality as Marcus stepped forward without resistance, his movements measured and unhurried, as though he had already accepted the path this situation was taking long before anyone else recognized it. And the younger officer reached for his radio briefly, speaking in a low voice that carried just enough for the older officer to hear, but not enough for the surrounding crowd to fully understand. While Ethan exhaled through his nose, a small smile returning as he folded his arms, watching the scene unfold with the calm assurance of someone who had seen outcomes like this before. And Marcus glanced once more at the street behind him, at the faint reflection of himself in the darkened glass of the storefront, the flickering lights distorting the image just enough to make it feel distant, almost detached, before he turned his attention back to the officers, his voice steady as he spoke. "I would like this interaction to be properly documented," he said, not as a demand but as a statement, something clear and intentional. And the older officer paused for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if reassessing the situation, not in a dramatic way, but in the subtle shift that comes when something does not fit the expected pattern. Yet he gave a short nod. "It will be handled," he replied, though his tone suggested closure rather than consideration. And Marcus inclined his head once, acknowledging the response without challenging it, while one of Ethan's friends pulled out a phone, holding it low at first, then raising it slightly as if deciding whether this was a moment worth capturing. And the glow of the screen lit his face faintly, reflecting a curiosity that had begun to replace amusement. And Marcus noticed the movement, but did not react, his focus remaining on the officers as they guided him toward the patrol car, not with force, but with an unmistakable direction. And as he reached the open door, he paused briefly, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve again, the same small, deliberate gesture, and there was something about the repetition that made it feel less like habit and more like preparation, as if each motion carried meaning beyond its simplicity. And he stepped inside, the interior of the car dim and enclosed, the faint scent of worn fabric and disinfectant lingering in the air, and the door closed with a solid, final sound that echoed just slightly against the surrounding buildings, sealing the moment in a way that words could not. And outside, Ethan shifted his weight, glancing toward the older officer. "That is all, right?" he asked, his tone casual but edged with expectation. And the officer gave a short nod, his attention already moving past the scene as if it had resolved itself. "We will take it from here," he said, and Ethan nodded back, satisfied, turning slightly toward his friends as the tension seemed to dissolve for him, replaced by the familiar comfort of control restored. While inside the car, Marcus sat upright, his hands resting loosely in his lap, his gaze fixed forward through the windshield where the red and blue lights continued to pulse, reflecting off the dashboard in steady intervals, and his breathing remained even, unhurried, the rhythm of someone who understood that time, not reaction, would shape what came next. And as the engine shifted into motion and the car pulled away from the curb, the city lights stretched into long streaks across the glass, blurring the line between movement and stillness. And in that quiet, contained space, Marcus closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in resignation, but in focus, as though aligning himself with something larger than the night, something already set in motion long before this encounter began. And outside, the street returned to its normal rhythm. Footsteps resumed, conversations restarted, the crowd dispersing as quickly as it had gathered, leaving behind only the fading echo of sirens and the faint imprint of a moment that had not yet revealed its true weight. The patrol car moved steadily through the city streets, the rhythmic pulse of red and blue lights fading as it turned onto a quieter road, the noise of traffic softening into a distant hum. And inside, the atmosphere shifted from public tension to something more contained, more deliberate, where every sound seemed amplified by the confined space. The low crackle of the radio, the faint vibration of the engine beneath the floor, and Marcus Reed remained still in the back seat, his posture upright, his gaze fixed forward, not on the passing buildings but on something internal, something measured and controlled, as if he were reviewing the moment piece by piece, not with frustration but with precision. And the younger officer glanced at him through the rearview mirror more than once, each look lingering a fraction longer than the last, as though trying to reconcile the calm presence in the back seat with the narrative that had been handed to him on the street. And it did not quite align, not completely, and that misalignment settled quietly in his thoughts, while the older officer kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel, his expression unchanged, shaped by years of experience that had taught him to move forward without questioning every detail, at least not in the moment. And the silence inside the car stretched, not uncomfortable but heavy, carrying an unspoken awareness that something about this situation had not yet fully revealed itself. And after several minutes, the car turned into the parking lot of the precinct, the overhead lights casting a harsh, white glow across the pavement, illuminating the building's facade with a clarity that felt almost clinical. And as the vehicle came to a stop, the engine idled briefly. Before the older officer shifted it into park, the motion small but final, signaling the next phase of what had already been set in motion. And the younger officer stepped out first, the night air cooler now, carrying the faint scent of asphalt and distant rain, and he opened the rear door, gesturing for Marcus to step out, and Marcus complied without hesitation, his movements smooth, unhurried. As he placed his feet on the ground and straightened his coat once more, the familiar gesture repeated again, and as he stood beneath the bright lights, the details of his appearance became clearer, the subtle quality of his clothing, the quiet confidence in his stance, elements that might have gone unnoticed in the dim streetlight, but now stood in sharper contrast. And the younger officer noticed it, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion but in curiosity, while the older officer moved ahead toward the entrance, already focused on procedure, on the steps that followed situations like this. And inside the station, the atmosphere shifted again, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, the faint echo of footsteps on tiled floors, the distant sound of phones ringing and voices carrying from behind closed doors, all blending into a steady rhythm of controlled activity. And Marcus walked forward calmly, his gaze taking in the surroundings with a quiet familiarity that did not match someone entering for the first time. And the desk sergeant looked up briefly, his expression neutral, then glanced toward the officers for context. And the older officer gave a short explanation, concise and to the point, framing the situation in a way that fit within the expected pattern. And the sergeant nodded, already reaching for a form, his pen moving quickly across the paper as he began to document the intake. And Marcus stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, his breathing steady, his presence unchanged despite the shift in environment. And as the process unfolded, the younger officer lingered nearby, his attention divided between the routine steps and the quiet sense that something in this room, something in this moment, was about to change in a way none of them had anticipated. Though he could not yet explain why, And in the steady hum of the station, beneath the bright, unyielding lights, the tension did not disappear. It transformed, settling into something deeper, something waiting, as if the truth itself had entered the room and was simply biding its time before being seen. The station seemed to slow around him, not in motion but in perception, as if the steady rhythm of phones ringing and keyboards tapping had shifted into something more distant, more muted, and Marcus Reed stood beneath the fluorescent lights with a stillness that did not belong to the usual flow of the room, his presence quiet but unyielding, while the desk's sergeant continued writing, the scratch of pen against paper sounding louder than it should have, each stroke deliberate, each line forming a version of events that had already begun to settle into record. And the younger officer remained a few steps away, his arms loosely at his sides, his attention drawn again and again toward Marcus, not out of suspicion but out of a growing sense that the man before him was not reacting the way most would. There was no urgency, no attempt to explain, no visible frustration, only patience, and that patience carried weight, the kind that made silence feel intentional rather than empty. And across the room, a wall clock ticked steadily, its second hand moving with precise, mechanical certainty, marking time in a way that felt almost louder than the voices around it. And Marcus's gaze shifted briefly toward that clock, not because he was anxious, but because he was aware of time, of sequence, of process, as if each passing second was aligning something unseen, something inevitable, and he took a slow breath, the kind that expanded his chest fully before releasing in a controlled exhale, grounding himself in the moment without resisting it. While the older officer spoke quietly with the sergeant, their voices low, procedural, discussing next steps as though this were routine, as though nothing about this situation required deviation, and yet, beneath that surface, something subtle continued to build, something that did not announce itself but made the air feel denser, more charged, and the younger officer shifted his weight slightly, glancing again at Marcus's hands, at the way they rested calmly, at the absence of tension in his posture, and it prompted a question he had not yet voiced, not because he lacked authority to ask it, but because he was not yet certain what he was trying to understand, and Marcus sensed the attention without turning, without acknowledging it directly, his awareness extending beyond what was visible, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, measured, carrying the same quiet clarity it had held on the street. "May I make a call?" he asked, not as a demand but as a simple request, and the sergeant paused, looking up from the paperwork, his expression neutral, assessing, then glanced briefly at the older officer, who gave a small nod, signaling approval, and the sergeant reached toward the desk phone, sliding it slightly forward. "Make it brief," he said, his tone routine, accustomed to the request without considering its significance, and Marcus stepped closer, his movements unhurried, his fingers resting lightly on the receiver before lifting it, the weight of it familiar in a way that did not register to those watching. And as he dialed, each number pressed with deliberate precision, the room seemed to quiet just slightly, not because anyone had asked it to, but because attention had shifted, drawn toward the small, simple act that somehow carried more presence than it should have, and the younger officer found himself listening, not to the words that had not yet been spoken, but to the silence between them, the pause before connection, the moment where everything could still be interpreted one way or another. And when the line finally rang on the other end, Marcus held the receiver to his ear, his expression unchanged, his posture steady, as if whatever came next had already been accounted for long before this night began. And in that quiet, suspended moment, beneath the hum of lights and the distant echo of voices, the truth edged closer to the surface, not with force, but with certainty. The line connected with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have, and for a brief moment, no one in the room moved, as if the simple act of a call being answered had shifted the weight of the air itself. And Marcus Reed spoke quietly into the receiver, his voice steady, controlled. "This is Marcus Reed," he said, pausing just long enough for the name to settle on the other end. "I am currently at the Central Precinct." And he did not raise his tone, did not add urgency. He simply stated facts with the calm precision of someone accustomed to being heard without needing to demand it. And as he listened, his expression did not change. but something in his posture became even more grounded, more certain, as if the moment he had anticipated had finally aligned with reality. And across the desk, the sergeant slowed his writing without realizing it, his pen hovering slightly above the paper as his attention drifted toward the call, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way they were spoken, the absence of hesitation, the quiet authority that did not fit the narrative forming in front of him. And the younger officer leaned subtly closer, his brow tightening just enough to reveal that the pieces were no longer fitting together the way they had at the start. While the older officer remained near the counter, arms crossed loosely, his gaze shifting between Marcus and the paperwork, still holding on to the assumption that procedure would carry them through as it always had. And Marcus spoke again, his tone unchanged. "Yes, I will wait," he said then. Listened, a brief pause stretching between breaths before he added, "Thank you." And with that, he lowered the receiver gently back into its cradle, the soft click echoing faintly in the room, and for a second, nothing happened, no one spoke, no one moved. The station held in a quiet suspension that felt heavier than any raised voice could have created, and then the desk phone rang, sharp and immediate, cutting through the stillness with a clarity that demanded attention, and the sergeant blinked, startled by the sudden sound, before reaching for it. Lifting the receiver with a practiced motion, "Central Precinct," he said, his voice routine, but as he listened, something in his expression shifted. Subtle at first, then unmistakable, his posture straightening, his eyes flicking quickly toward Marcus, then toward the older officer, and the room seemed to narrow around that moment, every sound fading into the background as the conversation on the line carried weight that could not be ignored, and the sergeant's grip tightened slightly on the receiver, his voice lowering. "Yes, sir. I understand. He is here." And he paused, listening carefully, nodding even though the person on the other end could not see him. "Of course, immediately," he said, and when he finally lowered the phone, the change in the room was complete, the casual rhythm of routine replaced by something sharper, more deliberate, and he looked directly at the older officer, his tone no longer neutral, no longer procedural. "We need to stop processing this," he said quietly, the words carrying more weight than their volume suggested, and the older officer frowned slightly, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with uncertainty, and the sergeant glanced once more at Marcus before answering. "That is Judge Marcus Reed," he said, each word landing with a clarity that left no room for interpretation, and the effect was immediate. The older officer's posture shifting as if the ground beneath him had moved, his arms dropping from their crossed position, his expression tightening as realization began to surface, while the younger officer stepped back slightly, his breath catching in a way he could not fully control, the pieces finally aligning into a picture that felt both obvious and impossible at the same time. And in the center of it all, Marcus remained still, his gaze calm, his presence unchanged, as though nothing had shifted at all, even as everything around him began to unravel. The words did not echo, but they landed with a force that reshaped the room in silence. And for a moment, no one seemed to know where to look, as if eye contact itself had become uncertain territory, and the older officer straightened instinctively, his posture shifting from casual authority to something more rigid, more controlled, the kind of stance reserved for moments when the chain of command suddenly extended far beyond the walls of the station, and the younger officer took another step back, his earlier curiosity now replaced with a quiet realization that carried both clarity and discomfort. While the sergeant cleared his throat softly, the sound small but noticeable in the stillness, his hand moving to the paperwork in front of him, not to continue writing, but to slide it aside as though the document itself no longer belonged in the present moment. And Marcus Reed remained exactly where he stood, his gaze steady, his expression composed, offering no reaction to the shift around him, no satisfaction, no visible acknowledgement, only the same calm presence that had been there from the beginning. And the older officer took a slow breath, stepping forward with measured care, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "Judge Reed," he said, the title coming with a weight that had not been present before, and the change in address alone seemed to redraw the lines of the entire interaction, transforming what had been assumed into something that required correction, and Marcus inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the recognition without altering his stance. And for a brief second, the older officer seemed to search for the next words, the right words, the kind that could reconcile what had already happened with what was now understood, but language felt insufficient, too small to contain the shift, and across the room. That recalibration, every movement slowed by the weight of what had just been revealed, and Marcus met his gaze calmly, without accusation, without hostility, simply present, and the chief stepped forward, his voice controlled, but carrying an undertone that had not been there before. "Judge Reed," he said, mirroring the officer's earlier address, but with a depth that came from understanding the full scope of the moment. And Marcus nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement, and the chief's jaw tightened slightly, the realization settling deeper, extending beyond the room, beyond the station, into implications that could not be contained within procedure, and for a second, the space between them felt heavier than any confrontation, not because of what was said, but because of what had already happened and could not be undone, and the chief turned his head slightly, his voice firm now, directed at the room rather than the man before him. "Release him," he said, the words simple, but carrying a finality that cut through any remaining uncertainty, and the officers moved immediately, the shift from hesitation to action swift and unquestioned, while Marcus remained still for a moment longer, as if allowing the room to settle into its new reality before taking a single step forward, his movements unhurried, his composure unchanged, and in that quiet transition, the balance of power did not just reverse. It revealed itself, exposing what had been assumed all along as something far more fragile than anyone had realized. The room did not return to normal after the command was given. It simply shifted into a quieter version of itself, one where every movement carried more awareness, more intention, and Marcus Reed stepped forward with the same calm precision he had held from the beginning, his shoes making a soft, steady sound against the tiled floor as he moved past the desk, past the officers who now avoided his eyes not out of disrespect, but out of something closer to reflection, and Chief Daniel Cole remained where he stood, his shoulders squared but no longer rigid with authority, instead weighed down by the realization that authority, when misplaced, revealed more than it protected, and for a brief moment, their paths aligned in silence, Marcus stopping just within a respectful distance, his gaze meeting the chief's not with accusation, not with anger, but with a clarity that was far more difficult to face, and the chief inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried both restraint and recognition. "Judge Reed," he began, his voice controlled but noticeably quieter than before, and he paused, as if searching for a way to bridge what had already happened with what should have been, but the space between those two realities did not allow for easy words, and Marcus gave a slight nod, acknowledging the attempt without requiring it to be completed. "What matters now," Marcus said calmly, his tone steady, "is not what was assumed, but what is understood," and the words settled into the room with a weight that did not need emphasis, because they were not spoken to correct, but to clarify, and the chief lowered his gaze briefly, not in submission, but in reflection, the kind that arrives when certainty is replaced by truth, and across the station, the younger officer stood still, absorbing the exchange, his earlier uncertainty now transformed into something more defined, something that would stay with him long after this night ended, while the sergeant quietly gathered the paperwork he had set aside, not to continue processing, but to remove it entirely, as if acknowledging that some records should never have been started in the first place. And Marcus adjusted his coat once more, the familiar gesture now carrying a sense of closure rather than preparation, and without another word, he turned toward the exit, his steps unhurried, his posture unchanged, and as he reached the door, the cool night air met him again, carrying the faint scent of rain that had finally begun to fall, soft droplets tapping lightly against the pavement, against the glass, against the quiet city that had already moved on without knowing what had shifted within it. And Marcus stepped out into that night, the streetlights casting a warm glow across the wet ground, reflecting his figure in long, steady lines that stretched ahead of him, and behind him, inside the station, the silence remained, not empty, but filled with the weight of recognition, of lessons that had not been spoken aloud but would not be forgotten. And Chief Cole stood motionless for a